In the quiet corner of the city stood an old building, its walls faded and its windows tired from years of holding secrets inside. It was the old age home where time seemed to move slower than anywhere else. The garden outside had dry leaves scattered across the ground and the benches carried the weight of forgotten stories. Every morning the sunlight would slip through the half-broken blinds, painting soft golden lines on the cold floor, and the sound of birds felt like whispers from the past. Inside, the rooms were filled with people who once had dreams, families, laughter, and homes of their own, but now they lived together, sharing silence and memories. Some sat near the windows watching the road, as if waiting for someone who had promised to come long ago. Others stared at the ceiling, their thoughts wandering between yesterday and what could have been. There was a strange peace in that place, a kind of calm that came from surrendering to time itself. Among them was a man named Farid. His hair was silver like the moonlight and his eyes carried a warmth that made others feel safe. He had a small wooden stick that he never really needed but liked to carry anyway. Perhaps it reminded him that he was still strong inside. He always smiled no matter how hard the day was. He would greet everyone in the morning and say, "Good day, friends, the sun has come again," like an old friend returning to check on us. His words made the others feel alive for a little while. There was also an old woman named Layla. She rarely spoke, but her eyes were full of emotions that words could never carry. She spent most of her time in the garden, sitting under a tree, her trembling hands tracing shapes on the wooden armrest of the bench. Sometimes she would hum softly a tune from her youth, a melody that even the wind seemed to remember. Farid often watched her from afar, wondering what memories she held inside her silence. Every afternoon they would all gather in the hall where a small radio played songs from the past, the kind of songs that made the air feel heavy with nostalgia. Some would tap their feet, others would close their eyes and sway gently as if dancing with invisible partners. Farid would sometimes tell stories of his younger days. He spoke of the city when it was alive, of laughter echoing through the streets, of children playing barefoot, and of nights filled with stars. His voice would fill the room like a warm breeze, and for a moment everyone forgot where they were. But when night came, silence returned, thick and heavy like a blanket. Each room would go dim and only the soft sound of breathing would break the stillness. Farid would lie on his bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about his son who had left him there years ago, promising to visit soon. The word soon had lost its meaning over time, but Farid still believed, maybe not in the promise but in the feeling that hope was worth holding on to. One evening a little girl came with her mother to visit her grandmother. She was about 6, her eyes curious and bright. She wandered into the hallway and found Farid sitting by the door. He smiled and said, "Hello little one, are you lost?" She shook her head and said, "No, my grandma lives here. Do you live here too?" Farid nodded and said, "Yes, this is my home now." She frowned and asked, "Where is your family?" Farid looked out the window and said, "Somewhere out there." The girl looked at him for a long moment and then said, "You can be my grandpa until yours come back." Her innocence touched him deeply. He felt something warm stir in his chest, something he had not felt in years. He laughed softly and said, "That sounds like a good deal." From that day she would come and sit with him whenever she visited her grandmother. They would talk, draw little flowers in her notebook, and laugh at small things the others in the home would smile watching them. It was as if a tiny spark had entered their slow fading world. Layla too began to notice the change. She would see Farid with the girl every weekend and sometimes she would smile faintly. One day Farid walked to her bench and said, "You know, you should join us." She looked at him surprised but said nothing. Still he sat beside her and for a while they both watched the sunset, the sky turning orange and pink like an old painting that refused to fade. From that day they became silent companions. He would sit with her every evening. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. Words were no longer necessary. The breeze carried their unspoken thoughts. The home began to feel lighter. Somehow laughter returned like forgotten music. Even the caretakers noticed how everyone smiled a little more often. And yet Farid knew that time was a gentle thief. It took moments, memories and people without warning, but he also knew that as long as they shared kindness it would leave behind something beautiful, something that time itself could not erase. The old age home slowly began to change from a place of endings to a place of quiet beginnings. That was the first time in years that the sound of laughter stayed long after the sun had gone down, and as Farid walked back to his room that night he whispered to himself, "Maybe the world still remembers us, maybe we are not forgotten after all." The morning light crept through the cracked windows and touched the faces of those who were still asleep. The air smelled of old wood and warm tea. Farid woke up early as he always did. He walked slowly to the small garden outside. The grass was wet with dew and the sky was painted in pale shades of gold. He took a deep breath, feeling alive. For the first time in a long while he could hear the birds singing the usual songs, as if they too had grown familiar with the people who lived there. Layla was already sitting on her bench, her hands wrapped in a shawl that once must have been bright red but now had faded to a gentle pink. She nodded at Farid when he approached and he smiled in return. They sat together quietly watching the gardener water the plants, his movements slow and careful like a man trying to give life to tired roots. Farid looked at Layla and said, "It is strange how things bloom even after being forgotten." She turned her gaze to the flowers and said softly, "Maybe they wait for someone to notice just like we do." Their bond grew deeper without them realizing it. Every day they shared tea and stories, sometimes about their youth, sometimes about things they could no longer remember clearly. Farid would tell her about his son who used to laugh like thunder on rainy days. Layla would tell him about her husband who played the violin under the moonlight. They both smiled as they spoke, their memories painting colors across the dull air of the old age home. One afternoon a volunteer came to visit. He was a young man full of energy and ideas. He wanted to organize a small celebration for the residents, something simple yet full of joy. He said they would decorate the hall with paper flowers and lights and everyone could share a song or a story. The idea spread quickly and even those who rarely spoke began to whisper in excitement. The place felt alive like a heartbeat returning after years of silence. Farid offered to tell a story on that day. Layla said she would sing a song she had not sung in years, one she used to hum to her children when they were small. The days leading up to the event were filled with soft laughter and anticipation. Some practiced their songs, others rehearsed little poems. The caretakers smiled seeing them so full of life again. On the day of the celebration the hall glowed with warm lights. Strings of paper flowers hung from the ceiling and the smell of food filled the air. Everyone dressed in their best clothes, some even wore perfume, as if welcoming a long-lost friend. Farid stood at the front, his hands trembling slightly but his eyes bright. He began to tell his story. It was about a boy who lost his way but found kindness among strangers and learned that love could bloom even in loneliness. His voice carried through the hall, gentle yet strong. When he finished everyone clapped their hands, their eyes glistening with quiet tears. Then Layla stood up, her voice a little shaky at first but soon it filled the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. She sang of youth, of time, of promises never kept but never forgotten. It was a song of sorrow and hope at once. When she finished the room fell silent, not because they were sad but because they felt something real, something pure. They had all lived long enough to know how rare that feeling was. Farid looked at her and smiled, the kind of smile that said thank you without words. After the celebration everyone sat together sharing food and laughter. The little girl came again with her grandmother and when she saw Farid she ran to him, hugging his knees tightly. She said, "Grandpa, your story was the best." Farid laughed, his eyes glimmering with tears, and said, "Thank you, little one, you remind me that the world still listens." As the night deepened the lights dimmed but the warmth remained. Farid and Layla sat outside once more. The stars twinkled above and the wind moved softly through the trees. Layla said, "It feels like the world has changed." Farid nodded. "Maybe it is not the world, maybe it is us. Maybe we have learned to see again." She looked at him and said, "You speak like a poet." He chuckled and replied, "Maybe age makes poets out of all who remember." But time moved as it always does and Farid began to feel tired, his steps slower, his hands weaker, yet his heart stayed kind. One morning he could not get out of bed. The caretaker came in and found him resting peacefully, his eyes half open, staring at the morning light. Layla came to see him, her face calm but her hands trembling. She sat beside him and whispered, "You kept your promise, you stayed until the end." He looked at her and smiled faintly, saying, "I told you life is beautiful when we choose to see it." And then his eyes closed softly like a leaf falling onto still water. The old age home grew silent once again. For a few days the laughter faded and the walls felt heavier than before, but Layla kept sitting in the garden. Every evening she would look at the bench where Farid once sat and she would smile, not with sadness but with peace, because she could feel the wind move around her, whispering softly as if keeping his promise. The days passed slowly in the old age home. The seasons shifted gently from warm sunlight to chilly winds, and yet the garden remained a place of quiet comfort. Layla continued her routine. Every morning she would sit under the tree watching the dew settle on the grass. She felt Farid's presence in the soft rustle of leaves and the distant song of birds. It was as if he had become a part of everything around her, a gentle echo that reminded her that love did not end with absence. The little girl visited often. She would run into the garden calling out for Layla, who would smile and take her hand. The girl would chatter endlessly about school, her friends and little discoveries she had made, and Layla would listen quietly, sometimes telling her small stories about the days she had been young. She spoke of dancing under the moonlight and of songs that could make even the darkest night feel bright. The girl laughed at every story and insisted that one day she too would learn to dance under the stars. Other residents began to feel the shift in the air. They smiled more often and helped one another without being asked. The atmosphere of the home became lighter, warmer and more alive. It was not as if the absence of Farid left a void, rather it had left a space for memories to bloom and for everyone to carry forward the lessons of kindness, laughter and companionship he had quietly planted among them. Layla sometimes walked through the hallways holding the little girl's hand and pointing to the faces of others. She would tell the girl the names and their stories. The girl would listen wide-eyed and imagine all the adventures they must have had in their youth. It was a game for her, but for Layla it was a way to keep the past alive, to honor the lives that had been lived, and to ensure that nothing was ever truly forgotten. She felt comfort knowing that the next generation would carry a piece of their history with them. One afternoon, Layla decided to organize a small garden gathering. She invited everyone to bring flowers from their rooms or the yard. Some brought roses, others daisies, and some even brought small branches with green leaves. Fareed would have loved this, she thought. Arranging the flowers together brought laughter and soft conversations. They shared memories of birthdays, weddings, and forgotten festivals. The garden filled with colors and scents that seemed to erase the walls of the home for a while and make it feel like the world outside had also come to visit. The little girl was particularly enthusiastic. She placed flowers beside every bench, as if each one were a throne for a story, and then she ran to Layla saying, "Look, see how happy they all are." Layla smiled and hugged her. The old age home had transformed into a place where life could still surprise and joy could still find a way into even the quietest corners. Evenings were still the most cherished time of the day for Layla. She would sit under her tree and feel the wind around her, sometimes closing her eyes, imagining Fareed speaking softly to her, telling her that the world remembered them and that they had left traces that would never fade. She smiled and felt complete in that moment, knowing that their journey had not ended, it had only transformed, and that love once shared continues to grow and reach even beyond the limits of life. The old age home had changed from a place of waiting into a sanctuary of memory and hope. It was no longer only a shelter for the weary, it had become a garden where stories flourished, where friendships blossomed, and where the gentle rhythm of life could still be celebrated without hurry or fear. Every room carried laughter, every hall echoed footsteps of people who had found new purpose, and the walls held warmth that even time could not steal. Layla remained a quiet guardian of that home. She nurtured the stories, she welcomed the young and the new, she smiled at every sunrise and whispered good night to every sunset. She carried Fareed's memory not as sorrow but as inspiration, a reminder that even in endings there can be beginnings, and even in silence there can be music. And as the years passed, she knew that the love, laughter, and hope they had shared would continue to grow long after she too became a whisper in the wind. And so the old age home stood proud and alive, a place where lives intertwined, where memories were honored, and where the simple truth of kindness and companionship illuminated every corner. A place where Fareed and Layla's presence could still be felt in every smile, every story, and every gentle breeze that carried the echoes of love and life to all who entered there.